Hello, I am Charles Landsberg and this is my second video on Spelljammer and how to spelljam in 5th edition. My voice is marginally better than last time. I have sugary tea, dark chocolate and 2 brand new sets of dice, none of which I believe will help with the matter. But let's dive right in. Again, this video is sponsored by nobody because I suck and you should stab me. The Phlogiston. The Phlogiston or Phlogiston, either pronunciation is valid. The flow, the rainbow ocean, is a bizarre concept in the cosmology of earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons. The concept was that every world setting such as the Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk, Dragonlance, etc. are all contained in discrete crystal spheres. Typically a crystal sphere has a central sun at its core, which is orbited by a series of planets or planet-like objects or planet-not-like objects. Spelljammer as a setting really does go out of its way to embrace its differences in this regard. Suns aren't stars, and neither are the stars. Suns are fiery bodies of actual elemental fire, and the stars that one might see in the night sky can range from many things being portals or glyphs or even cities or giant crystals that occur on the inner shells of the outermost objects in these systems, which are cosmically sized crystal spheres that surround and enclose each of these systems. Unlike in our real-life non-fantasy cosmology, where one might imagine travel between the stars as traveling from one star to another star, in Dungeons & Dragons, and more specifically Spelljammer cosmology, travel is thought of as traveling from crystal sphere to crystal sphere. And whereas in our real-life cosmology one might expect a vast amount of nothing between you and your destination, Spelljammer is packed a little more densely for obvious story purposes. Now inside the crystal spheres is usually what you'd expect, big fiery suns surrounded by planets, as I've said. This seems to be the standard, but there are exceptions, as we've seen in 5th edition's use of Doomspace, which breaks with convention for not only being host for a central body which seems to be the closest Dungeons & Dragons ever gets to a black hole, but also being surrounded by a broken crystal sphere, something which has apparently been ostensibly impossible. Mysteries abound and I offer you no questions or answers to Doomspace. The purposes of my video is discussing what happens when you get outside of a crystal sphere, and how to incorporate the Phlogiston back into 5th edition. Outside of these crystal spheres is where the setting of Spelljammer has in the past housed the Phlogiston. The Phlogiston would refer to both the space between crystal spheres, as well as the substance that suffused this space. Often described as a gas, an ether, a fluid, it seems that accounts of it throughout the systems are as varied in attempts to describe it as there are attempts at explaining how indescribable it is. Naturally, I will describe it for you, or this will be a very short video. A quick history lesson. The word phlogiston isn't just a fantasy word, but has actual roots in real history, and has even led to the discovery of the element oxygen. Regarding science, philosophy, chemistry, alchemy, physics, it needs to be pointed out that a lot of these things were interchangeable disciplines in history, and that the separation of these subjects is a relatively recent occurrence, particularly when it comes to the separation of metaphysics and physics, theory, hypothesis, experiment and proof, etc. But in the beginning of the sciences, it was philosophers who asked the question, well, how does it all work? And one of the earlier theories was the elemental model, which saw the world as effectively consisting of 4 or 5 classical elements: fire, air, earth, water, and ether being the 5th element. In 1667, Joachim Becher posited that there was instead 3 elements: terra lapidea, terra fluidea, and terra pinguis, stony earth, fluid earth, and rich earth. In many ways we can see the development of the states of matter in his writing, solid, fluid, and gas. But he goes further to say that terra pinguis included things like fire. His student, Georg Ernst Stahl, in 1703 renamed terra pinguis to phlogiston, after the Greek word to burn. He equated it to the weight lost by something that burnt, and suggested that phlogiston was a substance contained in all things that burnt, and was also responsible for an object's color. The theory completely collapsed after it was proven that some substances, when burnt, accumulated mass, such as metals oxidizing. Anton Lavoisier mistakenly believed that it was the substance that reacted with metals that was also responsible for acids, so he called it oxygen, from the Greek acid producer, oxus, sharp from the taste of acids, and genus, meaning maker. While the scientific concept of phlogiston was mostly abandoned by chemistry, the concept stuck around in alchemy and esoteric writings till the modern day, eventually finding its way into fantasy writing. In Spelljammer, the phlogiston substance is described as being not of the classical four elements, but a fluid ether, like air or water, that is difficult to contain and cannot be brought within a crystal sphere. Attempts at doing so will merely result in the phlogiston that you have somehow contained disappearing with no trace. It has no color and yet has a rainbow appearance. Art often draws it as being nebulaic in nature, with the Spelljammer fandom website providing an amazing image of the Carina Nebula. Some art draws it looking almost like Bifrost, resembling a river upon which or in which Spelljammer vessels can sail. Mr. Rex has a fantastic video discussing why gods fear space in Dungeons & Dragons, and I've provided a link below and you really should watch that video. In this video, Mr. Rex discusses how ships can vary their speeds by delving deeper into the flows of the phlogiston, and thereby actually speed up their ship's travel if the Spelljammer is smart enough to travel along with the currents of the flow. In this way, the phlogiston seems to have different densities and speeds at which it travels, sometimes acting like a gas, sometimes as a liquid. I wonder what phlogiston might look like if it were solid and what properties it might possess. Its origins are mysterious, and as Mr. X pointed out, the theories are many, and I cannot for the life of me remember where I heard or read this, but there is a theory that mentions that the phlogiston may even be the blood of the god Io, the overgod of the dragons, otherwise known as Ascarath, and for the life of me I cannot remember where I read or heard this. In the current iteration of Dungeons & Dragons, the phlogiston has just been replaced by the Astral Sea, which is kind of a weird shift. The astral plane or sea used to be beyond the prime material, the space between spaces, the realm of thought and gods, somewhere you could reach from anywhere, not necessarily somewhere separated by the issue of physical distance, but by virtue of coterminism, say in which the ways the Feywild and the Shadowfell are not far away in terms of distance, but overlapping in certain ways. In 5th edition, the Astral Sea has been moved into space, which is okay, sure, fine, whatever, but we can work with this. But I kind of miss the flow of the phlogiston, and again, as I've said, incorporating any of my, someone else's, or your own homebrew ideas should always be a case of if it fits, it fits. If it doesn't fit, forget it. But if you think bringing in ideas to enrich your player's experience of space, I think the phlogiston is a great place to start. A cosmology for D&D. 1. Let's say the astral plane is still in the prime material, but I would genuinely move it further away. The astral being the home of the gods, the place where you can find the dead bodies of gods and titans, a place where you could travel to in spirit with a whole silver cord thing, that should be far away, not merely something that you stumble into between crystal spheres. The far realm is also something that comes into play here. Maybe the far realm is as far away in the other direction as the astral is. Keep it distant. 2. Bring back the phlogiston, maybe not as a ubiquitous, everywhere, always, all at once gas, but have it as flows, as rivers that flow around and in between crystal spheres, where travel with it or against it could severely impact your travel time. 3. Keep it flammable. What is the phlogiston if it's not dangerous? Have ships put out fires and lanterns when approaching a flow? Fire and fire spells are 3 times as massive and 3 times as dangerous in the flow, and are triggered at their source, not where the spellcaster necessarily intended it. Firearms likewise discharge at the explosion point of ignition, and not where the gun is pointed. Although the flow gives off a faint rainbow glow of its own, ships would otherwise have to resort to magical light. 4. Consider, at least as a DM, to have a map of the kinds of spheres you want to include. Paul Westermeyer's official map of the flow is a good place to start, if you're sticking to the official Dungeons & Dragons settings. Charles Nerrick Taylor's unofficial map of the flow is probably the most well-known, extensive map I've ever seen made, incorporating much more than just the central Dungeons & Dragons and Spelljammer settings. It even includes Earth. That would be Earth, not Greyhawk Earth, but having a basic cosmology regardless of whether or not you have the Phlogiston is going to be useful for your Spelljammer games. 5. Whether space in or out of crystal spheres, whether Phlogiston or Nogiston, keep your space populated. When in reality flying through a real asteroid field would be very boring, as your average asteroid is miles away from the nearest next asteroid. At least have your so-called space highways filled with pit stops, astral diners, and rampaging musicals. Having your space empty is going to make your game boring. This has been a much less useful video in terms of mechanics. But I really like the Phlogiston, and I think its exclusion from the Spelljammer setting is a shame. I don't know, what do you think? Again, my Patreon is linked below. Buy me a coffee, go well and take care of each other, and remember that if everyone at the table is having fun, you're doing Dungeons & Dragons the right way. Thank you for listening to my rant. If you want to watch the first video I made in this series, the link is over here.